Welcome to Bike Racing Without Mercy. Today's video is a progression on the one from last week, comparing my anaerobic threshold as calculated in the laboratory with the same threshold but derived using a standard 20-minute functional threshold power test. Now the lab test used my physiological data requiring 2 testing protocols plus Adam, a sports scientist, taking measurements of my gas exhaled and blood lactate in order to calculate the inflection point where my body maxes out on its aerobic engine, in turn requiring the anaerobic system to kick in and assist with the effort, whereas Zwift's 20-minute FTP test is highly accessible and calculates the same threshold but by taking 95% of my maximum 20-minute power. So stay tuned to see how accurate the 20-minute FTP test is, and for Adam to impart all kinds of knowledge, including why it's important not to overstate your FTP in order to train better and ride faster. Well, following Saturday's lab test, I figured it might be quite interesting to do a compare and contrast of my anaerobic threshold, which as we saw lies somewhere between 265 and 275 watts, with my functional threshold power, my FTP. I'm using Zwift's FTP short test, which also includes 5 minutes before the main test at VO2 max, just to drain the energy a little bit before you have 6 minutes of recovery. I'm at 155 watts and then you hit the main event, 20 minutes max effort, and to derive your functional threshold power, your FTP, you take 95% of that amount. Anyway, going to crack on with it, but as I say, hopefully an interesting compare and contrast, a little bit of bro science to add to Adam's, proper science. Under Zwift's short FTP test, we first have a 5-minute VO2 max effort, which I think is intended to drain our energy tank a little bit ahead of the main 20-minute test. And based on an assumed current FTP of 285 watts, it's been a while since I've tested this, Zwift in turn prescribed 3 minutes at 315 watts into 2 minutes at 340 watts. And I duly obliged. No soft pedalling for me in order to gain the system, with 3 minutes at 319 watts and 2 minutes at 344. I think it's important to have this 5-minute effort ahead of the 20-minute test, because otherwise there's too much of your anaerobic energy system, i.e. your VO2 max left, to assist with, I guess, flattering the 20-minute power, when you ramp up the effort in the final 5 minutes or so. This drains the tank a little bit and hopefully will make the 20-minute test and the FTP derived from that a little bit more realistic versus my lab-derived anaerobic threshold. Here we go. Hoping to negative split this. Keep the effort under control. Going to turn the fans on, focus on the breathing and the pedaling technique now. So what exactly are we trying to achieve with any FTP test? Well, from Adam in the lab, we learned that if we ride at or just below our anaerobic threshold, then our body will be able to maintain an elevated but stable state in respect of our lactate in the blood, our heart rate, and our breathing, our VO2. So whether in the lab or more normally during an FTP test, what we're trying to find is the power where this physiological steady state can be maintained for 30 to 40 minutes. Over to Adam for a slightly more eloquent explanation.
This VT2 is the gas exchange version of threshold. So it's basically what FTP is looking for, it's what critical power is looking for. These are all kind of metrics of this threshold, and it's effectively the maximal power that you can output and maintain a metabolic steady state. So in this instance, you kind of have elevated VO2, you're using more oxygen because you're working hard. You have elevated lactate, the pH in your muscle might have dropped a bit, but all these measures will actually hit a plateau, and then they'll stay in their elevated or their decreased levels respectively. Whereas above this power, you're then dipping into your kind of anaerobic fuel tank, as it were. You won't be able to maintain
the glycogen in the muscles. That kind of thing,
yeah. So at that point you'll get like a real kind of heavy amount of anaerobic glycolysis going on, and your body's not able to to buffer against that with any kind of aerobic capacity, because you've maximised your aerobic capacity basically, and at that point you're depending on how far above the threshold you are, you're then going towards exhaustion. You're never going to hit a steady state. Conventionally, you do a 20-minute FTP test. That's a slightly limited one because 20 minutes doesn't really mean much physiologically. What you're looking for here is the delineation between what's deemed in physiological terms the heavy and the severe intensity domain, i.e. one where you can maintain a steady state and one where you cannot, because above it you're burning through what's deemed as W prime, and then you're burning through your anaerobic reserves until you get to exhaustion. Below it, the determinants of fatigue are much different, so it's actually that then comes down to things like muscle glycogen and thermoregulatory drift, and even neuromuscular fatigue. So actually your neurons effectively get quite tired and they don't want to drive the muscles anymore. So in terms of performance, this is a really important metric. This is a power you can hold between 20 minutes to 40 minutes depending on how fit you are as an athlete.
So above our anaerobic threshold and of course our FTP, if accurately calculated, from a physiological perspective, we're no longer able to maintain a steady state for 30 to 40 minutes because our anaerobic engine is heavily active, causing our blood lactate to increase and more metabolic waste than the body can actually clear. And our heart rate and our VO2 max also head upwards as we deplete our anaerobic energy capacity, i.e. our W prime. And once the W prime is expended, we either have to stop.
1 minute left at 350. Really good, get it, okay, it's nice and high. Done.
Or rapidly drop back below the anaerobic threshold so as to let the body clear the metabolic waste and also to allow the energy systems to recover. Adam used a ramp test with the power increasing by 25 watts every 3 minutes in order to reach a point where I capitulated due to exhausting my anaerobic energy capacity and my VO2 max also at its peak. And from the data from the gas exhaled, he was able to calculate my VO2 max and also get a strong estimate that my anaerobic threshold was around 277 watts.
Yeah, so if we jump back to this VT2, so this is an indicator of where your threshold would sit. So where his critical power might be, where his FTP might be.
And remind us what those numbers were again. So
this is coming out as 277 watts.
For the VT2, the anaerobic threshold, yeah.
So, but this is based purely on gas data, and also this is within the realms, this is kind of, we're getting this data from a test that's set up to get you a VO2 max number primarily.
So in order to hone in on a more accurate number for my anaerobic threshold, my VT2, a second test was needed. And after a decent break and a can of Coke to replenish the glycogen, we then completed a 3-step ramp test comprising 10 minutes just below my estimated anaerobic threshold, 265 watts, straight into 10 minutes at 275 watts, and then a final 10 minutes just above my estimated anaerobic threshold at 285 watts, measuring both gas exhaled and lactate in the blood. The second test confirmed that I was indeed in a steady state or an equilibrium at 265 watts with my lactate stable at 3.8 millimoles. But as the power ramped up to 275, so did my lactate, my heart rate and my VO2. Therefore, Adam was able to conclude that my anaerobic threshold lay somewhere between 265 watts and 275.
Below this threshold, your heart rate's elevated, your VO2's elevated, you're utilising more oxygen, and you'd expect things like your muscle pH to drop a little bit, but they stay at a steady state. You maintain basically metabolic homeostasis. Above this threshold, that's not possible.
Let's have a look. So we get to 275 power.
Yeah.
See, I'm no longer at steady state, so I've gone up from 3.8 to 4.3 after 4 minutes, 7.5 after 8 minutes, and at the end of the 275 segment, I'm in 8.1, and is 8.1 quite a lot of lactate?
Oh, that's pretty high, yeah. You're working, there's a very large proportion coming from anaerobic.
Am I still clearing there, or
Well, so you're clearing some of it at the maximal rate your body's able to clear it, but actually the accumulation is greater than the clearance. For threshold, this is where it comes kind of more into race or climbing performance. We're then talking about, so it came out as 277, I think, on there. On the test. We've then done it kind of more specifically with a high resolution Bear in mind this is on slightly fatigued legs, so it might be slightly undercooking a bit. Basically, we can say it's between 265 and 275.
Yeah, I reckon that's about right.
So after 2 tests in the lab, Adam could say with some certainty that my anaerobic threshold, my VT2, lies somewhere between 265 and 275 watts. But now we find out if my 20-minute FTP test provides a comparable number, and in turn, a close match with the physiological steady state that we're actually trying to find whether in the lab or smashing out the 20-minute test.
Dear me. Yeah, I got my negative split. I think I pretty much drained the tank. I was super happy with that. I think I paced it about right in terms of the negative split and the build of power. I didn't have a lot left in me. I had nothing really left in me at the end. Maybe I could have gone 30 seconds earlier. But I think average power there, 303. First time I've gone above 300 watts for 20 minutes for quite some time. And 95% of that is 288. And obviously that compares to 265 to 275 as calculated in the lab.
Handing back to Adam for the truth.
Kind of oft underappreciated within cycling is the fact that you've got two very distinct domains. You've got one where you're just, if you're sat in it, even if you're only 5 watts into it, you are eventually just going to go to fatigue likely within about 20 minutes.
So you're saying really that here at 265, like, I'm coping, right?
Yeah.
It's hard,
Yeah.
but I'm coping, I'm clearing, I'm restocking the energy systems.
Yeah.
But even, 10 watts above, and you're saying it could be as little as 5 watts above, then this lactate starts to build, the body stops being able to clear
Yeah.
the waste products, it stops being able to it starts to become overwhelmed, and it's actually quite a thin range.
Yeah,
there.
it's quite because it is a somewhat discrete threshold between two exercise intensity domains, and they've got differing fatigue profiles. Yeah, above it, basically your capacity to tolerate anaerobic metabolism, and the capacity you have to do that's going to determine how long you can go. Whereas below it, it's completely different things. It's then burning through actual amounts of muscle glycogen you've got left. It's like how well you can tolerate an increase in core body temperature, neuromuscular fatigue. There's various different other factors, and obviously with different fatiguing factors, you're going to get different training adaptations as well. So that's why it's quite important to delineate these two zones. And yet the limiting factor actually comes down to the accuracy of the power measurement. Most power meters are plus or minus 2% or 1%. Yeah. That's going to be much.
What's the accuracy of that?
0.5% is what that does, because that's like a hospital grade testing bike, whereas most like power meters nowadays are about 1%, which is a greater confidence range than actually is likely to be the kind of threshold zone between the two zones. The issue generally with FTP is
don't help out.
Yeah, so FTP at a population level, if you averaged everyone's FTP, it probably would give a good indication of the average threshold, but it varies so much, and you vary kind of 20 watts one way or the other versus a true threshold, which is usually determined at the gold standard to do critical power testing. It can vary on an individual to individual basis by 20 watts, and this is why and that kind of lack of confidence in the results that you're getting is why FTP sits, like, for example, in the middle of zone 4. Yeah, it's a threshold. It should be sitting between zones, because that's the threshold between zones. The zones have different.
It's an inflection point.
Yeah, they've got different. You get different training adaptations from them. That's the whole point of having the training zones. You do zone 2 because you want to get base miles in. You want to get increased polarization and things like that. You do zone 4 because you want to increase your threshold. But actually, it should be that potentially, FTP, or the threshold, to sit between zone 3 and zone 4, arguably, because they have different. You're going to go to fatigue for different reasons in each one of them, and your training stimuli and the training adaptation you get from them are going to be different.
Yeah, and that's very clear. So if like my threshold is 265, you can see physiologically, the lactate is stable, heart rate stable, breathing stable, but the moment I'm going much above it, things are changing quite rapidly, lactate and everything. So, and I guess I've always found that taking 95% of my 20-minute power is leading to a power that's really a little bit beyond me. I kind of blow quite quickly. I find that the 95% is I think the 95% is, you know, more like 10% off for me is more accurate.
Well, yes, this is the issue. So, and it's worth saying with this data, the conclusion we can come to is that Phil's threshold is between 265 and 275. We don't know exactly where it is, but it's within that range. But given that power meters aren't that accurate, that's a good ballpark, you know, kind of estimate to have it there. Also worth saying, he did this on fatigue legs, which makes it quite impressive. He did it after the ramp test. In a perfect world, you come back in completely fresh and do this test completely fresh, and the numbers might be slightly higher with that, but it's often, you know,
things I do for entertainment.
You also, you know, in the real world, you're very rarely training on completely fresh legs anyway.
So in the real world, you know, 20-minute power, 95% is what we're told to do on training like Zwift. What is the typical range in terms of, you know, from what you see in the lab for people's threshold versus their FTP?
So for some people, it does end up being bang on. For some people, it'd be 20 watts over, 20 watts below, usually often within 10, 15, but that's, you know, that's quite a large swing, and there's also quite a large confidence interval.
Well, it's a large swing in the context of what happens in such a small amount of watts between your threshold.
Yeah, exactly, and this is the thing. So if you've got it set, just because FTP is a kind of a slightly flawed way of testing it, 10 watts too high, you're actually going to be sat above threshold when you're doing threshold efforts, and you'll be doing over-unders, and they're actually, the unders are too high because of it, for example.
Well, when you're sat, I mean, say you were sat trying to do a threshold effort on the climb and you're sat 10 watts above, with that 10 watts above, to Adam's point, you've got limited kilojoules, limited energy that you can spend above your threshold.
Yeah, and this is the issue, like FTP, it's a very nice, easily digestible test. It's 20 minutes, everyone knows what 20 minutes is, you just do it, and people get quite good at pacing for it. But for most people, that will be, for the vast majority of well-trained cyclists, 20 minutes is above threshold. The amount that it's above threshold varies quite a lot depending on your genetics, your training status, how well fueled you are at that point. A lot of different variables go into it. And then this whole idea of just knocking 5% off is not great. I mean, on average, it's actually, there's only been one study that's properly looked at this, which is actually quite shocking because it's such a well-used metric. That found that it was actually closer to 7% on average you should take off. But even then, it varied a huge amount. It tended to be that the better trained you were, the kind of closer you were to being an elite cyclist, the closer to your 20-minute power you could hold for your 1 hour, and then the less well-trained you are, the bigger the gap. So,
and actually that really resonates with me, because as I just said, you know, I reckon I'm 10% off pretty consistently in terms of my hour of power versus my kind of FTP derived 20-minute power.
Yeah, so you know, you're building your house on the sand somewhat by doing a 20-minute test rather than a physiologically derived test. You're then adding in a further degree of uncertainty by taking a slightly arbitrary kind of population level percentage off it rather than a personally derived one. And then you're setting training zones based on that, even though a 1 hour power is by definition, so a 20-minute power is for the vast majority of people above threshold. A 1 hour power is by definition, unless you are like, even like Felipe Ganna, that's going to be below threshold for him, because 1 hour you're very much into the heavy intensity domain. No one can sit at their actual threshold for an hour. So you're, yeah, physiologically.
Oh, that's actually interesting as well, because I am a lover of the hour of power, and you know, I often think, well, that's roughly where my threshold is, but you're actually, that's below my threshold.
Yeah, so you're very much, you know, it's for most people it's comfortably below, because most people just cannot hold.
Well, often on my hour of power, I am in around about the 275 watt range there.
Yeah, so and that makes sense, because you know, we've done this test on tired legs, so it might have shifted things down by 5 watts. You know, inside, outside, is different. Different variables coming in, things like that. We weren't able to have the fans on in here because they affect how the ventilatory data gets collected. So yeah, it might be this is like come down the slightly conservative side of things, but this is given actual ideas of what's going on under the hood, whereas FTP is trying to do it in a top-down manner that might on average work for a whole group of cyclists, but if you go on an individual level, you can't have too much confidence in that number actually being true.
Whereas if I do 303 watts from that 20-minute power and reduce it by 10%, i.e. the upper end of the range that Adam was talking about, he says the average is about 8%, then my FTP is 272.7, i.e. 273 watts, which is right in the pickle barrel in terms of my anaerobic threshold per the lab, but also that relatively recent 1 hour FTP test outdoors where I read the hour of power at 273 watts. So, just goes to show, FTP, you know, gets you into, I guess, the ballpark, but it's not necessarily accurate for everybody. And as we saw in the lab, you know, just going 5 watts to 10 watts above your anaerobic threshold, you're starting to eat into those limited energy reserves. And you deplete, I guess, your endurance very quickly. You burn out much faster. Whereas if you're 5 watts below your physiological anaerobic threshold, you're going to go fast, but for a lot longer.
I think we've got some incredible insight that will hopefully help people with their own training ideas and maybe testing.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to get you into a lab, but not everyone has access to a, you know, an indirect kilometre to analyse gas data and things like that. But hopefully the principles of what we've looked at, you can then, you know, as long as you've got an understanding of the underlying physiology, that means you can actually apply it to, you can think, oh, is my FTP actually my FTP? How does this, you know, if you've got heart rate data, you've got power data, you've got, you know, perceptions of exertion are actually
you can look for the inflection points where things start drifting up.
Yeah, exactly. You know,
kind of sustain.
You know, can I actually, if I sit at my threshold, does my heart rate actually stay consistent across a 20-30 minute period? If it doesn't, that's above your threshold, I'm afraid. So, like, you know, it's quite simple. So, yeah, hopefully some of the, you know, some of the stuff we've done here, and we've got the numbers that have kind of given it a nice visualization, but they're generally applicable principles. They're well conserved kind of physiological parameters that we've been looking at.
And as Adam says, if you don't have access to a lab, and most of us don't have access to the lab, you can still kind of interpolate in, hone in on where your physiological anaerobic threshold is. If you're maybe doing 10 minutes of power, 10 or 15 watts below your FTP, 10 minutes at it, and then 10 minutes above it, a continuous ramp. But observe the sensations, i.e., how does the lactate feel in the legs? Do you feel like you're kind of in equilibrium and clearing it? Is your heart rate stable? How is your breathing? Is it controlled still? Does it feel like an effort you could sustain for 40 to 60 minutes? And then if you go up another 10 or 15 watts and that still feels good, you know, you're kind of honing in on your anaerobic threshold. But if your heart rate starts to rise and you're struggling to clear the lactate from the legs and the breathing's getting less controlled, then you kind of know that probably your anaerobic threshold is a bit lower. So drop it back down and find where that nice equilibrium is. Anyway, super interesting that. Hope you enjoyed the video. Do remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed, please do. And in the meantime, whoever you are and whatever you do, please remember to live, thrive and stay healthy.
Anyway, cheers Adam, thanks a lot, and I'll be back to see where I get to.
Yeah, excellent, look forward to it.
Absolutely, take care.